I'm not a wizard, and you know what? I think that's good. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we'll be talking about one specific book, and that is, of course, Wizard of the Pigeons by Megan Lindholm, also sometimes writing under the other pen name that is Robin Hobb. It's an old book. It's a really good book. You should read it. We'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick sort of rundown of what to expect, that it will be spoiler-free. Then you go and read the book, which you really, really should, and it's short. It's like 200-something pages. And then I'll talk about why I think it's really, really, really good, which will take up most of the time of this video. But before we move any further, I want to give a quick sort of note. I will be talking about this in sometimes, as liminal fantasy, which is a term I took from Farah Mendelssohn's book, The Rhetorics of Fantasy. I read that last year, and she discusses this book in some detail. If I am saying more than just giving you a quick rundown of why this is liminal fantasy, and I'm not quoting it, that's because my brain is mush and I did not reread the thing, but maybe some of my views on this book have been heavily influenced by that, and I'm just no longer aware. So yeah, I'm not stealing, I'm just, not remembering correctly, and too lazy to double check. Anyway, let's get started, shall we? Alright, Wizard of the Pigeons from 1985 is an urban fantasy set in Seattle in 1983. It's about a wizard who lives in Seattle and has magic and deals with pigeons, which is, why it's called Wizard of the Pigeons. He has some other wizard friends, and together they're sort of in charge of making Seattle safe and keeping Seattle safe. It's also the story of a wizard who may or may not be a homeless guy living in Seattle, hanging out with some of his friends who may or may not also be homeless guys. So that's something that you know from the outset. And something comes to Seattle and endangers the city, and Wizard has to face it down to save the city, to save himself, and to save his friends. And that's the plot. It's a very short one, and it kind of sort of oscillates between those two stories of Wizard, the homeless person, and Wizard, the wizard, trying to save the world and themselves. Classic wizard shit, basically. It's really short, it is really dark, and it's really sad. It's also really, really, really good, and you should definitely read it. I don't want to get into any, spoilers here. That's the point of this short one. Let's just say that since it is set in Seattle in 1983, it deals with the aftermath of the Vietnam War, which, as you can imagine, has some heavy topics in there. So be aware of that. Discussions of PTSD can trigger you, and discussions of some domestic violence can trigger you. Yeah, this will happen in here. Nothing graphic, but it certainly is always somewhere in the background, so be aware of that. Beyond that, yeah, go read this fucking book. It's absolutely amazing, and it may help you understand some of the things that happen in Robin Hobb books afterwards, when you see sort of like where a lot of this kind of started in a lot of ways. So if you like Robin Hobb books and can deal with an urban fantasy that is different from, say, your Jim Butchers and so forth, yeah, check this one out. It's really, 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 really good, is what I'm saying. So now you go and read the book, because, you should, and I just told you so numerous times, and I drink some beer, and then we'll talk in detail about what this book does and why it is so excellent at what it does. You're back. Awesome. I hope you enjoyed the book. I hope it made you think. I hope it made you cry, like it did me. And now let's talk about some general things and some more specific things that I have written down and hopefully not forgotten since I switched off my computer. Alright, let's start with the first part. This is obviously urban fantasy. Now, urban fantasy is a genre that has obviously changed a lot over the years when, first became an actual sort of marketing term, but what we'll use here for the time being is, it is fantasy set in our world, in a city in our world that, has fantasy elements in it. How they manifest is obviously different from book to book. Now, yes, there is stuff like the Dresden Files and a lot of more like Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter, a lot of these kind of stories. Technically, I guess the Twilight Saga is also what you might call urban fantasy. That is something very contemporary. Ben Aronovich's Rivers of London are another example. And then there's, of course, standalones like Kraken by China Miéville, those kind of stories. There have been stories like this for the longest time. You go back all the way to, say, Arthur Marken's The Great God Pan. That is technically, I would argue, urban fantasy. There are later ones, I would argue, one that I think is necessary to mention here is, for example, A Fine and Private Place by Peter S. Beagle. And we'll come back to why I think this one is a good example. Then there's something that I think also is a good example is Our Lady of Darkness by Fritz Leiber, because we'll come back to that in a second. So those are all different forms of having magic in the real world, in our world, in a known city. Now that's urban fantasy for our purposes here. So I already mentioned that this is set in Seattle, and so this is obviously urban fantasy. Two things that I want to talk about here in the context of urban fantasy before we move on. The first part is, for a urban fantasy to be truly urban fantasy, the city itself has to be something of a character within the narrative. You have to actually ground it in a specific city, ideally in a specific space and time. A city in a specific era, time, and so forth. For example, with Kraken by China Miéville, this is done like very, very explicitly, where the city is basically a living character. If you read something like N.K. Jamison's The City We Became, that's the same thing, right? The city has, like, manifests in persons. It is a character in a way. And that can be also, like, more vague in that how the city is built, how the city feels sort of influences the whole story that is told. You can see that, for example, in Our Lady of Darkness, for example, where, yes, that is very much the case there as well. Here, this is much more tuned back, but it very much feels like Seattle, and the way this is explored is, of course, through Wizard wandering as a homeless person through Seattle. We learn a lot about different monuments, buildings, places, bus stops, coffee shops, all of these kind of places where a homeless person wanders around in a way that we as non-homeless persons, or not we as, like I as a non-homeless person would not necessarily encounter, because we are obviously usually rushing from somewhere to somewhere else. We are seeing the city through very different eyes. That, I think, is an important part, and that makes this book very much stand out. This feels very much grounded in Seattle in a lot of ways, the way we have, Wizard remembering specific parts and bits and pieces of the history of Seattle, the Great Fire, the Totem Pole, the original Skid Row, all of these elements that are brought up from time to time, ground this both in space and time and give Seattle a lot of, background and weight that, for example, I, as someone who has never been to the States and therefore never to Seattle, would not necessarily know, but it feels very Seattle. It's also very much set in time. There's one small bit that I just find really funny that dates this book in a very specific way, because at some point, Wizard is talking and thinking about coffee shops and one good coffee that he wants to get. And he mentions a coffee shop, that is Starbucks Coffee, Tea and Spice Corporation. That's Starbucks. And in 1983, Starbucks did only have one or maybe two shops in Seattle. That's all of them. That's the original, right? And you hear that now, you read that now, and you're like, why is Starbucks such good coffee? That's not what I associate with it. And that does give you a specific setting and time that I found is like really, really interesting for me personally. It kind of nails it down and dates the story in a way that I don't think harms it, because it is obviously also very much dated by, being mentioned that it is set in 1983, and the larger topic, of course, of Vietnam veterans and those that have been scarred by Vietnam in a lot of ways, and the Vietnam War in a lot of ways. So that's just like the first part. The second part is, of course, the homeless people. And I want to talk about that for a moment, because I think it's an essential part of the story, of course. But it does, Robin Hobb, or in this case, obviously, Megan Lindholm, does something very interesting with that whole concept. See, yes, it talks about Vietnam veterans. It goes into several directions, and we'll come back to that. It's not just people that actually fought in Vietnam, it's also people they left behind. She explicitly talks about that in the introduction to the 2020 edition, and I'll maybe come back to that near the end of this video, if I remember to. So what is important here is that they're obviously homeless people, and we learn about that throughout the book, but there is a second class of people, a group of people in there that are also homeless, that have moved so far out that they are not even seen as homeless. And Wizard sort of straddles that line throughout the story. Sometimes he's seen as a, homeless person and treated as a homeless person, which is with disdain. And sometimes he's just ignored and not seen at all. He's basically invisible by, virtue of being a wizard or something else. And that is an interesting topic, and I want to bring up two examples where this also is sort of dealt with. One of them in a both tragic but also obviously humorous way is, of course, in the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett, right? We have the invisible people, which is, comes up in later books, the ones that live under the bridge, under Misbegot Bridge, I guess, in Ankh-Morpork, with, Foul Old Ron and Coffin Henry and so forth. And Pratchett calls them explicitly the invisible people because while people may stop for beggars and stop for beggars and homeless people, they just ignore the invisible people. And that's, Pratchett making sort of like aspects of our existence, of our society, very literally true, like very literal in a lot of ways. Another example here, once again, is, I think, sort of the framing of A Fine and Private Place by Peter S. Beagle, where our main... one of our main characters has sort of left his life behind and stepped completely out of society and is now living on a graveyard. Once again, the invisible people basically fully dead to society in a way that more visible beggars and homeless people are not, unhoused, are not basically dead. And this, I think, is an important differentiation, and I think something that Megan Lindholm does in this book is sort of give those people a place, a story, an existence that would otherwise completely fail because we, as the rest of society, we don't see those people. We completely don't see those people because they have stepped so far away from society, which, gives us the question, like, what do these people do? And is there, some existence that we can create simply through storytelling? And that is something that I think is very powerful for me. It is also certainly something that is very difficult to do. So that's the urban fantasy part. Move on to liminal fantasy. As I already mentioned, liminal fantasy is a term, termed by Farah Mendelssohn in her book The Rhetorics of Fantasy, where she sort of comes up with different forms of fantasy to categorize the larger field of fantasy. Liminal fantasy, in particular, means a book that is maybe fantastic or maybe not fantastic, or the elements of the fantastic are hard to pin down and can always be questioned, which, in this book is very clear. Is Wizard actually a wizard, or is he imagining all the things that he does? Is all the magic just a result of trauma, of mental health struggles, or is it in fact actual magic? Are the things happening here happening because of, the fantastic, or are they just happening within the imagination of the character? And that is that liminal sort of like space that this book straddles in a lot of ways, which is why Mendelssohn examines this specific book in detail in Rhetorics of Fantasy, which, go read that book if you can find it somewhere. I think it's a really helpful book if you are interested in, thinking harder about fantasy. There's more of those kind of books, but this one in particular, highly recommend it. All right, so now let's move on to the next part, which is Jung. Carl Jung, to be precise. And there is an attraction between Jungian ideas and fiction writers, and has been for a long time. And we'll get back. This will sort of like be overshadowing the next part of this video, right? So Jung being a bit of a, psychologist, or what passed for a psychologist in the early, the first half of the 20th century, split from Freud for all kinds of reasons, became a bit of a cult leader in a lot of ways, and has, is to blame for people like Jordan Peterson. Also came up with ideas of how to, treat people with mental health issues. And one thing that he came up with is, of course, terms like shadow work and so forth, going on a journey into yourself and facing up to, your inner struggles, overcoming certain archetypes. He's the inventor of Jungian archetypes and so forth. I am not an expert. I've read one book on the topic, but this is sort of like where he starts, what his aspect to doing this, which is, I don't know the English term. In German, it's Tiefenpsychologie is his specific version of doing that. So it is sort of like questing into yourself, overcoming struggles and so forth, finding out who you truly are, coming back a better person. Rings a bell, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. Because someone else came along, well-known misogynist, massive dickhead, and so forth, Joseph Campbell. Read too much Jung and came up with the concept of the hero's journey, which he then applied to all myths ever written, and said, like, that's always this one story of the hero going on a quest, coming back, and so forth. This is just the story that we always tell, because every story is about self-exploration. Had a bit of an impact on, everything written afterwards, because, people like George Lucas read it and said, like, well, I'm going to build like $1 million, billion-dollar empire on this, and so forth. Why am I bringing all of this up? Well, I think this book here, Wizard of the Pigeons, does deal heavily with these themes, but also does refute them in a certain way. And that's sort of like where we will go next. Part of this whole idea is, though, that we can certainly find specific archetypes, specific story elements and so forth in at least larger parts of the global sort of literary canon. We can recover and rediscover certain archetypes. And that is certainly something that we see here, and that Megan Lindholm very much deploys here, with especially our magical characters being very clearly patterned after specific characters from history, from mythology, and so forth, right? The names, well, Wizard is just Wizard, but we have Rasputin, which, you know who Rasputin is. And then we have Euripides, the beggar and violinist. Euripides being obviously a writer of Greek tragedy, probably, well, one of the main three ones in a lot of ways. So that is another character, which tells us something, right? Euripides being sort of like on the outside and so forth does line this up in a way as a tragedy in a lot of ways. And then there is, of course, Cassie. Now, Cassie is Cassandra. Now, if you know anything about Cassandra, it is, of course, that, part of the Trojan War, one of the daughters of Priam, the one that has all the warnings that no one ever heeds. And this is certainly something that is played out in detail in this story. When, Wizard goes down into the whole, the whole trip possibly back to his former life with Linda. We have that long sequence where Cassie shows up in all these different faces and all these different personalities and tries to warn him, and he ignores her, and only realizes that she was right afterwards. Very classic sort of Cassandra retelling in this regard. And this is kind of the point, right? Retellings, every story is in a way a retelling of other bits and pieces of stories that we kind of put together in different places. Another one that I found really interesting is one scene when Cassie discovers Wizard for the first time. We have this scene where he's freezing behind a dumpster and slowly seems like he is almost drifting into a streetlight. You can read this as like a gender-switched version of the Little Match Girl in a lot of ways, right? Someone is completely lost and doesn't have anywhere to go and freezes in the snow. And we have, scenes like that from time to time showing up in this story. And I think this is, once again, this is on purpose. It shows us that this is an exploration of the soul of our human condition through the medium of storytelling, and very much telling a story that is full of other elements of storytelling. Sometimes they're symbols and archetypes. Sometimes they are full sort of like story arcs, almost like Cassie's, for example. Symbols very clearly as well, right? We have the scene where Linda takes one of Wizard's pigeons and tries to forcefully bend its wings down, which is, not at all a symbol or simile for what she does later when she tries to engulf Wizard, the person. So now we have settled that part of both the liminal fantasy and the Jungian hero's journey thing. And one part that is important here is that recently I had a situation, workshop kind of thing for a lot of people with different mental health struggles, and the coach tried to tell us about the hero's journey as one way of framing our struggles and becoming better people, which, me being a dickhead, I was very mean to her and tried to explain why I think the hero's journey is outmoded as that kind of thing, because Jungian psychology is kind of bad, which shows you a lot about me and so forth. I just want to bring this up as an example to show that this is very much still a thing and influences how we tell stories and how we try to tell stories about ourselves, which may or may not be good. So let's move on to the next part, and the actual things that Robin Hobb, or in this case obviously Megan Lindholm, does with Wizard of the Pigeons and the topic of trauma, of PTSD and Vietnam. Let's start. Wizard is or may have magic powers because of, the trauma that he suffered in Vietnam. Now, this is interesting. That's a theory that Rasputin voices, and I think the idea that sometimes people going through brutal trauma having different ways of seeing the world afterwards is obviously one way of framing that. It has also been done by other fantasy authors. The idea that you have to undergo a traumatic encounter or something to then have magic is something that we will encounter again once the Sanderstorm hits and we talk about Mistborn, where it is very much turned into mechanics and not really thought about afterwards because that's Sanderson. But I think it's here it is much more of a storytelling idea. It's like we have this because, some people are different and have been fundamentally changed, and calling them wizards or calling it is one way of doing that. There's obviously another story there, the idea of, domestic violence and so forth, when we hear the story about the different roosters. When Cassie talks about, the idea that teaching children to raise animals and do all of these things and then kill them can be seen as a way of turning people into violent people, into domestic abusers and so forth, the way we, things we do to soldiers. It's a massively good part. I wish I could quote it, but, go read the fucking book and then you know what I mean. It's really good. So we have sort of that story. You also have obviously Cassie's idea of, magical people showing up from time to time, like threads in a tapestry, which brings us back to the idea of storytelling and storytelling having meaning and bringing meaning and having the right story to explain the right thing. So we have the idea of magic as one response of trauma. There are, of course, other forms of trauma, and this is, I think, vital and ties back to the whole introduction that Megan Lindholm wrote in 2020, when she talks about that Vietnam obviously not only traumatized those who went, but also those who were left behind, whether it's, siblings, family members, friends, lovers, partners, and so forth, and people come back, change, or don't come back at all, and what does that do to people? And I think, in a way, that is certainly something you can see with someone like Linda, who clearly has her own struggles, and other people that we meet in the book that also have, suffered from this. It shows that a event like Vietnam, the Vietnam War, does change everyone. And while it's obviously important to focus on the trauma of veterans not getting anything of the likes of appreciation that, say, veterans from World War II got, how that certainly broke people, how the way that society kind of ignored them afterwards, how they were certainly failed by the state, by the veterans organizations and so forth, makes it important to kind of focus on those people, but forgetting that all of society suffered under this is also important. Something that I think also is sometimes looked at in a book like, The Things They Carried, which you also should definitely read because it's, a really, really good book. But yeah, I think it's good that Megan Lindholm looks at that and shows that there are other traumatized people in this world. So now that we have spoken about that, let's move to the next part, because one important element of trauma is, of course, how we deal with trauma and how society deals with those who have trauma. And one thing that society does is it has high expectations. And if we fail these expectations, this does, of course, can be happening because of, unresolved trauma, but it can also reinforce these traumata. And this is once again where we have obviously the flashbacks that we see with Wizard sort of being on his quest back into his past, into his soul, and we have the conversations he has with his either ex-girlfriend or ex-wife. It's never fully clear who he left or got kicked out because of domestic violence and all of these breakdowns that he has because of being in Vietnam for a while, and then talking to his parents and all of these people. His parents in particular his father in particular goes, yeah, well, you fix yourself and then we can solve anything else. There are expectations there, the same way that there are expectations when he tries to do that, and he talks to the guy in the veterans office and goes like, well, just tell me what's in that box. that box of trauma that kind of symbolizes the trauma, right? These are societal expectations. The same way that Linda is not living up to her societal expectations when her sister tells her to, get married and do all these things and don't behave in any different way. And it's important to understand that if you don't live up to societal expectations, that kind of puts you already on that sort of like one step outside of the frame, right? You already go one step back. So now we've spoken about all of that. Let's talk about the whole of like relationship thing. Because then, of course, like an easy way of reading this, not love triangle, like triangle relationship between Cassie, Linda, and Wizard, and see like Cassie as the good one and Linda as the bad one, seeing Cassie as the Madonna and Linda as the whore. But I think that is very much very much simplifying it in a way that I don't think is valid. What we see is two traumatized people, Linda and Wizard, falling into a pattern of codependence. Linda certainly tries to give and help Wizard in all kinds of ways, and through that very much almost smothers him, whereas he, of course, as someone who has very much left his former life behind, is ready to fall into that, have someone else take over for him, have someone else sort of like take care of everything. This is obviously a very common pattern that we have, that a lot of us have probably seen or lived through ourselves. I certainly have been in situations where it was very, very comfortable to just like let someone else take over and lay back, and it does never end well. That's a key point here. But I think it's important to understand that like there are two people who have agency and who are both doing something that is in there because of past trauma, and that transcends that simplified idea of like the whole Madonna whore complex thing. It does, however, still not mean that there is like actual love. We'll come to the love thing in a moment, right? But that's the first part. The next step that we need to take from here is, of course, finding out who we are. We are coming to the core of that Jungian hero's journey into Wizard's self, where he discovers and has to face who he truly is. And then go back and become maybe... Well, he has that choice of going back, the socially maybe semi-accepted Vietnam veteran who sits at home, drinks beer, and gets some like benefits and so forth because maybe he's not employable or anything of the sort, or he can step out and be Wizard. And this idea of like finding out who you truly are is, as I said, like at the core of this hero's journey, and you come back changed in one way or another. And Wizard does make that choice at the end with the help of his friends, finding out who his, people are. In this case, this, of course, it turns out to be Cassie and Euripides and Rasputin, and of course his flock, the flock of the pigeons that he has built up. And one thing that I think is important here is the way this is like actually slapped into him by his true friends when he realized that he has, set up himself to fail, which once again is something that happens to just about everyone who deals with, depression and other mental health struggles. It's a very clear thing, and Cassie spells it out because Wizard doesn't, necessarily understand that, but that's, why friends do interventions, I guess. And then he comes back changed. And he faces all of that, all of his friends help with love, friendship, and so forth. And he faces his inner demon, which is all the PTSD, all the trauma, which, is called MIR as, the acronym for his previous name. And he destroys it. And he goes back out. He recognizes that his true love has always been through the ages Cassandra. And she helps him. She gives herself up for him. And... as a result of that, is once again wounded too far because magic has rules, and the rules are there to, protect the people that have suffered too much. And as long as they follow those rules, they will, be relatively safe. If you add rules that will make you fail, then you obviously descend into Wizard's trauma. And if you break the true rules, then you will, in fact, completely fail, which is what Cassie deliberately does, and give herself up, and then... either walks away across the sea or, well, I guess in the less liminal interpretation, just like steps of the wharf into the sea, and we all know what happens then, right? So that's the point here. That's where the story ends. Why is this important? That's the Jungian reprise. See, in that idea of the hero's journey, you are the hero, you come back, and you are saved. If this is, according to Campbell and Jung, something that will heal you from your psychological trauma, you should be a healed and good person. What we as society usually assume is that after that, you will, or we will, live up to society's expectations. But this is not what happens. Wizard ends up being Wizard. He decides that he is actually truly Wizard and not, someone else. And this is, I think, where we can argue that this book does refute the hero's journey, or takes the hero's journey and refutes it as sort of this healing way of finding, health under like societal norms, in the way that, say, Jungian psychology would use that. Instead, it is maybe that for some people, trauma is just too much to heal that way, and you have to let go of it and be someone else, move on, leave all of that behind, and become a different person. And if that means stepping further out into the realm of the invisible people, of the wizards in this case, then that's what it is. And I think that is really powerful, because it can help us step away from that really toxic idea of we have just have to go fight our demons on our own, and then we will become the person that everyone expects us to be. Maybe we are not meant to be that kind of person. I think that is very helpful. That is very powerful. But it's I would argue it does subvert the hero's journey and the Jungian elements of it in particular, which is good. So brings me back to the final thing. In her introduction, Megan Lindholm talks about how this is her attempt to maybe give hope by telling a story about how maybe what happens to the people that were changed. Everyone was changed through that war, and finding hope. I think that's a very understandable goal. I think it succeeds because it tells you a story. And Wizard and Rasputin and the other, wizard, I guess, are keeping Seattle safe by doing their things, and it gives purpose and it gives story to the people that we have maybe shut out of our imagination, that we have shut out of our world, fully shut out, because even beggars and the unhomed fulfill a role in the way we see society. But what about those that have completely gone beyond that? And it gives them a purpose, it gives them a story that we can then maybe use for ourselves to, well, if not heal, then at least maybe find first steps on a path to healing. All right, these are my thoughts on Wizard of the Pigeons by Robin Hobb. In this case, obviously, Megan Lindholm. Gods, it's bad to always mix up those two. I really, really, really enjoyed this book. I found a lot of myself in it, even though I've obviously never been to Vietnam and any of those thoughts. But the observations on how we deal with trauma, how we deal, or how we narrativize our different stories, life stories, I found very poignant. I hope you found something in this book. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have thoughts on it, let me know them down in the comments. If you have no thoughts on them, let me know that in the comments as well. Subscribe, share the video if you feel like it. Become a channel member or become a Patreon subscriber if you feel like giving me money, which, I can live with more than 90 with more than $1 in my pockets. I promise you. Although sometimes I have very much exactly that. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me. I'll talk to you about something else very soon. And until then, well, cheers.